The moment the divorce papers were signed, something snapped, but not the way you'd expect. No screaming. No tears. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes right before everything changes. While her ex-husband was across town, smiling beside his mistress and booking a $75,000 engagement party, she stood on cold courthouse steps with one thought echoing in her mind. Enough. Enough years of sacrifice. Enough quiet humiliation. Enough funding a life she was no longer part of. With trembling fingers but absolute clarity, she opened her banking app. 15 supplementary credit cards, all tied to her name. All feeding the fantasy life of a man who had already walked away. One tap. Then, another dot, and somewhere in a luxury hotel lobby, a sentence from an event planner froze the groom-to-be mid-swipe. This isn't just a divorce story. It's about timing. Control. And what happens when patience finally runs out. The courthouse didn't look dramatic. No thunder, no rain, no movie-style breakdown. Just a wide set of gray steps, people coming and going, and a thin stack of papers that somehow weighed more than 20 years of marriage. She stood there for a moment after signing, clutching the folder tighter than necessary, as if letting go might cause everything to collapse all over again. The ink was barely dry, the paper still warm from her hands, and yet the relationship it represented was already ice cold. When her ex-husband turned away, he didn't hesitate. No backward glance, no awkward pause. He walked faster, like someone late for something more important. A car waited at the curb. Tinted windows. Inside, a younger woman in a pink coat. The confirmation didn't hurt the way she'd imagined. There was no explosion of anger, no sobbing, just a clean, terrifying clarity. 20 years of routines, compromises, swallowed words, ended not with drama, but with silence. And sometimes, silence is louder than screaming. The cold wind cut through her thin jacket, and she realized she'd rushed out that morning without thinking. Funny how, after years of planning meals, schedules, finances, and other people's needs, she hadn't planned for herself at all. Her body shivered, but inside something burned steady, controlled, and sharp. This wasn't grief. This was release. As the car pulled away, she didn't follow it with her eyes. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, not to call anyone, not to cry to a friend. Her thumb hovered for a second, then moved with certainty. Banking app. Supplementary cards. 15 of them. For years, those cards had felt like extensions of her own spine, quietly supporting everyone else while she stayed invisible. One for her husband, one for his sister, others for relatives, friends, people who treated her generosity like an entitlement. She remembered how easily she'd agreed when he'd asked, how convincing he'd sounded talking about cash flow and temporary needs. She hadn't hesitated then. Now, she didn't hesitate either, but this time it was different. The first card she canceled was the one he used most often. She knew the last 4 digits by heart. She also knew what it had paid for just a month earlier, a designer handbag. Thousands of dollars, not for his wife, but for the woman sitting beside him in that car. The app asked for confirmation. A simple question. Are you sure? Her thumb pressed yes. The notification appeared instantly. This card has been successfully canceled. The phone buzzed softly, but to her, it sounded like a door locking for the first time. One by one she canceled them all. Each confirmation felt lighter than the last. Ping, ping, 15 small vibrations, each one cutting another invisible thread that had tied her to a life of quiet exploitation. By the time she finished, her hands were steady, her breathing slowed. Somewhere across town, someone was about to discover that fantasies are expensive and consequences are immediate. She didn't rush home. She walked, let the cold air hit her face, let reality settle. A street vendor selling warm roasted nuts caught her attention, and on impulse she bought a small bag. The warmth seeped into her palms, grounding her in the present. From now on, I live for myself, she promised, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the kind of resolve that doesn't need witnesses. She didn't know yet about the hotel lobby, the failed card swipes, or the event planner's sentence that would freeze her ex-husband mid-smile. She didn't know how quickly her quiet decision would ripple outward, pulling family members, lawyers, threats, and truths into its wake. All she knew, standing there with warm nuts in her hands and divorce papers in her bag, was that the woman who walked down those courthouse steps was not the same woman who had walked in. And once that shift happens, there is no going back. The first sign that her decision had landed came sooner than expected. She had barely set her bag down at home when her phone buzzed, not a message from a friend, not a bank alert, but a voice note. It was short, breathless, almost excited. A friend who worked in fashion, someone who knew how the city's luxury hotels really operated, didn't waste time on small talk. "I just saw your ex-husband," the voice said. "He's booking an engagement party, $75,000, big ballroom. He's acting like money isn't even a question." The woman listening leaned back against the kitchen counter and smiled, not a cruel smile, not even a triumphant one. It was quieter than that. More like recognition. While he was building a fantasy on borrowed foundations, she had already pulled out the beams. Timing, she realized, is often more powerful than anger. Across town the illusion was still intact. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, an event planner with a tablet, nodding politely as he described a party meant to announce a new beginning. The groom-to-be swiped a card without a second thought, then another, then another. The machine didn't beep in approval. It paused. The planner frowned, tried again, and finally looked up with professional confusion. "Sir, it seems these cards are no longer active." One sentence, calm, neutral, but in that moment, the air shifted. Smiles stiffened. Whispers crept in. And for the first time, the future he'd been selling suddenly demanded proof. He laughed it off, made excuses, blamed the system. But deep down he knew. Only one person could have done this. And she had done it without raising her voice, without showing her hand, without ever stepping foot in that hotel. Back in her apartment, the knock came hard and fast, violent enough to rattle the doorframe. She didn't open it right away. She already knew who it was. Her ex-sister-in-law had never believed in knocking politely, especially when she felt entitled to something. The shouting started almost immediately. Accusations, threats, demands. When the door finally opened, the woman stood calm, arms crossed, watching the performance unfold. The bag clutched in the visitor's hand was instantly recognizable, another purchase made on a card that no longer existed. Rage poured out. "You can't do this. He's used those cards for years. We've all used them." And that was the moment the truth slipped out so easily it was almost funny. Used, not borrowed. Not asked for, used. The woman didn't argue. She simply placed the contracts on the table, names, clauses, ownership. Facts don't raise their voices. They don't need to. The confrontation ended the same way most entitlement does: confusion, then retreat. But it wasn't over. She knew that. Canceling the cards hadn't just stopped payments. It had disrupted a system of dependency that had fed off her silence for decades. Every buzz of her phone, every echo in the hallway, reminded her that this was only the beginning. Still, she didn't regret it. For years, she had been told that being generous meant being quiet, that love meant enduring, that stability required sacrifice. Now she understood the lie beneath all of it. Control doesn't disappear when you give it away, it just waits for you to take it back. And with one decision, 15 cards, and a perfectly timed silence, she had done exactly that. At the hotel, embarrassment doesn't arrive loudly. It seeps in. It starts with a pause that lasts half a second too long, a polite smile that tightens at the edges, a staff member glancing down at a screen and then back up again. He stood there in a tailored jacket, shoulders squared, mistress at his side, selling confidence with every breath. Another swipe, another excuse. A nervous laugh meant to reassure everyone watching. But the terminal stays silent, unmoved by charm or entitlement. Finally, the event planner leaned in slightly, lowering her voice the way professionals do when delivering bad news. Sir, I'm sorry, but these cards have been deactivated. We'll need another method of payment to proceed. The words were gentle. The impact was not. In that moment, the ballroom lights seemed harsher, the chandeliers less forgiving. Wealth, it turned out, was only impressive as long as it worked. He felt it immediately, that sinking sensation behind the ribs, the one that tells you something has slipped beyond control. The people around him didn't need to say anything. Their silence said enough. The planner's expression shifted from accommodating to cautious. His fiancée's smile faltered, just briefly, but long enough to notice. He stepped aside, phone in hand, fingers moving fast now, panic creeping into the spaces where arrogance used to live. One call, then another, no answers. No solutions. And with every failed attempt, the truth pressed closer. This wasn't a technical error. This was deliberate. Somewhere else, at almost the exact same time, a woman who had been invisible for 20 years was calmly living her afternoon, completely untouched by the storm she had triggered. When the call finally came through to her phone, she didn't answer immediately. She let it ring. Not out of cruelty, but out of control. For once, she decided when the conversation would begin. When she did pick up, the voice on the other end exploded, rage, humiliation, disbelief colliding all at once. Have you lost your mind? He shouted. Do you know what you've done? She listened without interrupting, the way she had learned to listen over years of marriage. But this time, she wasn't absorbing the blame, she was observing it. When he finally paused to breathe, she responded with just 2 words, calm, steady, unmistakable, yes, I canceled them. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. He demanded explanations. She didn't owe him any. The cards were hers, always had been. The illusion that they were his had existed only because she allowed it. That was when the threats began, predictable, desperate, poorly disguised as authority. He spoke of embarrassment, of reputation, of how she was ruining his future. She said nothing until the noise burned itself out. Then, quietly, she reminded him of something he had forgotten long ago. Actions have consequences, even when you've been shielded from them for years. Hanging up, she didn't feel victorious. She felt finished. The kind of finish that comes after clarity, not revenge. Somewhere, a party was unraveling before it ever began. Somewhere, a man was realizing that confidence without control is just noise. And in her living room, with the late afternoon light spilling across the floor, she understood something essential. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about finally stepping out of a role she had never agreed to play. The knock came less than half an hour later, sharp, aggressive, and relentless, the kind that wasn't asking to be let in but demanding surrender. It echoed through the apartment, rattling the doorframe and sending her old cat scrambling under the sofa. She didn't jump. She didn't rush. She wiped her hands calmly, walked to the door, and stood there listening. She already knew who it was. The voice confirmed it, high, shrill, laced with entitlement and fury. Her ex-sister-in-law didn't bother with pleasantries. Open the door right now. Do you think you can hide? The woman inside exhaled slowly. 20 years ago, that voice would have made her heart race, would have pushed her into apology mode before she even knew what she'd done wrong. Now it sounded distant, almost small. She opened the door just enough to face the storm head-on. The woman barged in without waiting to be invited, as if the apartment still belonged to her family by default. She wore a flashy dress and clutched a designer handbag that was instantly familiar, purchased on one of the very cards that no longer worked. The bag was slammed onto the table like evidence, metal chain clinking loudly as accusations poured out. Have you lost your mind? Those cards have been in our family for years. My brother is humiliating himself at a hotel right now because of you. The words are hung in the air, heavy and revealing. The woman listened, arms crossed, eyes steady. When the shouting finally paused, she responded simply, almost casually, yes, I canceled them. The explosion that followed was predictable shock, outrage, disbelief that someone who had always complied could suddenly say no. Instead of arguing, she went to her study and returned with a folder she had kept untouched for years. Contracts, statements, names printed clearly at the top. She placed them on the table and pointed to one line, primary cardholder. Her name, not his, not theirs, hers. The room shifted. The ex-sister-in-law glanced down, then back up, scrambling for denial. These are old papers. My brother said he changed everything. Calmly, without raising her voice, she pulled out her phone and opened the banking app. Ownership unchanged, rights intact. The truth didn't need volume. It needed visibility. The shouting faded into frustrated muttering, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that entitlement doesn't hold up well against documentation. The conversation ended the only way it could, with threats disguised as moral outrage, accusations of cruelty, claims of family loyalty, warnings that this wasn't over. She listened without flinching, then pointed to the door. If you don't leave now, I'll call the police. That did it. Pride cracked. The woman stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to shake the walls. Silence returned, thick but manageable. She locked the door, leaned against it for a moment, and felt something unexpected relief. Not because the confrontation was over, but because she had faced it without shrinking. She knew more knocks would come, different voices, louder tactics, but the hardest one, the first, had already passed. And she had remained standing. The second knock came softer, slower, measured in a way that tried to sound reasonable. It carried the illusion of calm, but she recognized it immediately. Authority wrapped in concern. When she opened the door this time, it wasn't rage standing there, it was judgment. Her former mother-in-law stepped inside without waiting for permission, wearing the coat she herself had gifted years ago, shoes still muddy as they crossed the freshly cleaned floor. She set a heavy cloth bag on the table and sighed deeply, as if the weight of everyone's mistakes rested solely on her shoulders. Sit, she said, patting the sofa. We need to talk properly. The woman pulled over a chair instead. She had learned that proximity can be a power move. Distance, she discovered, was clarity. The lecture unfolded predictably. Accusations of cruelty wrapped in concern, appeals to history. 20 years together, the older woman repeated, as if time alone justified betrayal. She spoke of embarrassment, reputation, and how a man starting a new life shouldn't be burdened by financial inconvenience. Listening, the woman felt something harden, not anger, but resolve. When the justification crossed a line, when infidelity was dismissed as a mistake, and her own childlessness was implied to be a failing, she stood up without a word. She returned moments later carrying another folder. This one was heavier. Receipts, ledgers, transfers, years of quiet proof. She spread them across the table, one by one, letting the past speak for itself. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't dramatize. She pointed, a fever she endured alone while money went elsewhere. A modest gift she was told was too expensive, contrasted with jewelry bought freely for someone else. Business accounts she had managed meticulously, while funds were siphoned away in increments large enough to build a fantasy life. Numbers stacked up quickly when they finally stood in the light. The older woman's authority faltered. Her hand shook as she reached for an apple, then dropped it to the floor. Still, she insisted, he earned that money. You're the daughter-in-law. Obedience is your role. The word obedience landed like an insult from another century. The woman laughed, not bitterly, not loudly. Just once. Controlled. Final dot when the performance shifted from guilt to theatrics, tears, wailing, threats of public shame. The woman opened the door wider instead of closing it. If you want the neighbors to hear, let them hear everything, she said calmly. Let them decide who is right. The crying stopped instantly. Dignity, it turned out, was still valuable, just selectively defended. Moments later, the door slammed shut again, harder than before. The woman stood alone in the aftermath, apples rolling on the floor, silence reclaiming the room. She cleaned up slowly, methodically, her hands steady. 20 years of receipts weren't just proof of theft. They were proof of endurance. And now, finally, they had a purpose. She barely had time to sit down before the phone rang. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't saved but would recognize anywhere. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she opened the recorder on her phone and placed it quietly on the table. Experience had taught her something important: anger fades, words disappear, but evidence lasts. When she finally answered, the voice on the other end exploded without warning. No greeting. No pretense. Just rage, humiliation, and panic tangled together. He shouted about the hotel, about the looks people gave him, about how she had made him look like a fool. Each sentence was louder than the last, as if volume could restore authority. She listened, calm, fingers gently stroking the old cat curl beside her, grounding herself in the present. When he demanded an explanation, she gave him one brief and unembellished. "I canceled the cars, nothing more." The silence that followed was sharp, followed quickly by threats disguised as wounded pride. He spoke of love, of history, of how she was cruel for cutting him off without warning. The irony almost made her smile. When she reminded him of the handbags, the transfers, the engagement party funded by money that was never solely his tone shifted. Anger turned defensive. Defensive turned threatening. He warned her not to push things too far, insisting that the divorce was over and she had no right to revisit the past. She said nothing until he finished. Then, evenly, she told him she had contacted a lawyer. The reaction was immediate. Panic leaked through the cracks of his bravado. The threats escalated. He spoke of public shame, of dragging her name through the neighborhood, of sending his family back to her door again and again until she broke. She let him talk. Every word was being recorded, cataloged, preserved. When she finally responded, her voice was calm but unmistakably firm. "If you come here again, I will call the police. If you threaten me again, I will use this recording." There was no emotion in her tone, no anger to feed off, no fear to exploit. That was when his voice faltered, just slightly. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It slips, slowly, audibly, and she heard it happening in real time. After the call ended, she saved the file and uploaded it to the cloud, naming it carefully. Proof wasn't paranoia anymore, it was protection. Standing by the balcony as dusk settled over the neighborhood, she felt something shift again, quieter this time but just as important. She was no longer reacting. She was preparing. Threats no longer terrified her. They exposed desperation. Tears no longer moved her. They revealed manipulation. And the truth, documented, organized, undeniable, was finally on her side. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it blindly. She had her voice back. And this time, she was keeping it. The lawyer's office was smaller than she expected, but it felt solid, clean lines, neatly stacked files, plaques on the wall that spoke of quiet victories rather than flashy promises. She sat across from the desk with her briefcase in her lap, fingers interlaced tightly as if holding herself together. Beside her, her friend offered a reassuring presence, the kind that doesn't need words. When the lawyer finally looked up from the documents she had laid out, receipts, ledgers, bank statements, screenshots, his expression didn't carry surprise. It carried recognition. He had seen this story before, just with different names. That alone gave her comfort. The truth, she realized, wasn't unique, but justice still mattered. He moved through the papers methodically, asking only necessary questions: dates, amounts, intent. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of pages turning. When he spoke, his tone was calm but firm. The transfers were clear. The timing was crucial. Money moved before the divorce was finalized was still marital property, regardless of whose account it passed through. The numbers told a story that emotions never could. As he spoke, she felt something inside her loosen, like a knot that had been pulled tight for years. For the first time since the courthouse steps, someone wasn't asking her to be understanding or forgiving. They were explaining her rights. When she asked the question she'd been carrying since the moment she canceled the cars, "Can I actually get it back?" The lawyer didn't hesitate. Yes, not maybe. Not possibly. Yes. The documentation was strong. The ledger entries were meticulous. Even the smaller transfers added up, and intent could be established. He explained the next steps in plain language: court orders, bank records, formal claims. No drama, no intimidation. Just process. Law, she realized, was power structured into fairness, slow, sometimes frustrating but grounded in evidence. And she had plenty of that. When she left the office, the sun felt warmer than it had all day. On the sidewalk outside, her friend squeezed her hand and laughed softly. See? I told you. She smiled, not the smile of revenge, but the smile of someone who could finally see a path forward. This wasn't about punishing him anymore. It was about reclaiming what had quietly been taken and rebuilding something of her own. For years, she had been told to endure. Now, she had learned something better. Endurance is not the same as justice. And for the first time in a long while, justice felt within reach. The first message from the mistress arrived late in the evening, glowing on the screen like an uninvited guest. A friend request. A profile photo drenched in filters, confidence, and borrowed luxury. The woman stared at it for a moment before accepting, not out of curiosity but certainty. She knew this conversation would come sooner or later. It always did. The messages followed immediately, flooding in without pause. Photos first. A ballroom drenched in light. A white dress with an impossibly long train. A diamond ring held up like a trophy. And finally, a smiling photo of the couple in front of an elaborate menu. Every image was designed to impress, to intimidate, to rewrite history. The accompanying text was worse, bragging, taunting, dripping with the belief that money equaled victory. She responded slowly, deliberately. No insults, no anger, just questions. Who was paying? Did he have the funds? The reply came fast, defensive, almost desperate. The mistress insisted he was wealthy, that his business was thriving, that the divorce had settled everything. The woman didn't argue. She sent screenshots instead. Transfers, dates, amounts. Proof that the luxury on display was built on money that didn't fully belong to him. The typing bubbles disappeared for a long time after that. Silence, she knew, was rarely a good sign for people living on illusions. When the response finally arrived, it was shorter, sharper, less confident. Accusations replaced arrogance, jealousy, obsession. The woman read it without emotion. This wasn't personal. It was structural. The engagement itself was already cracking behind the scenes. A quiet confirmation from a hotel insider revealed the truth. The deposit was incomplete. Deadlines were approaching, and promises were being stretched thin. Tables reserved, menus printed, but payments stalled. A celebration built on credit and confidence doesn't collapse loudly, it frays. Guests weren't confirmed. The planner's patience was wearing out. The venue didn't care about love stories, it cared about numbers. And numbers don't bend for appearances. As the deadline loomed, the fantasy required more and more explaining. The kind that leaves stains even if everything goes through in the end. By the time the mistress blocked her, the damage was already done. The screenshots were saved. The evidence organized. The woman didn't feel satisfaction, only clarity. The engagement wasn't cracking because of her words. It was cracking because it had been hollow from the start. What shattered wasn't a romance. It was a lie dressed up in white fabric and expensive lighting. She turned off her phone, fed her cat, and sat quietly in the living room. The noise had finally died down. And in that calm, she understood something important. When the truth enters the room, illusions don't survive for long. When he asked to meet, his voice sounded unfamiliar, soft, almost careful, like someone stepping onto thin ice. She knew immediately this wasn't an apology. It was strategy. Men who apologize sincerely don't rehearse their tone. They don't negotiate locations. Still, she agreed on one condition. She wouldn't come alone. He accepted too quickly, which told her everything she needed to know. At the cafe near her home, sunlight spilled through the windows, illuminating dust motes and half-finished cups. He was already there when she arrived, seated stiffly, hands wrapped around a latte he rarely drank before. For a second, he looked like a man trying to remember who he used to be. Then his eyes flicked to the lawyer beside her, and the mask cracked. He started with small talk, the kind that pretends the past can be skipped over. Compliments, regrets phrased vaguely enough to avoid responsibility. He blamed misunderstandings, circumstances, pressure, anyone but himself. She listened quietly, not interrupting, letting him build the version of events he wanted her to accept. Then came the real offer. A peaceful solution. A lump sum that sounded generous until it was weighed against what he had taken. He spoke quickly now, trying to control the pace, insisting she had no job, no leverage, no reason to drag things out. The words landed flat. Across the table, the lawyer opened the briefcase. Documents changed the atmosphere instantly. Receipts laid out like timestamps of truth. Bank records aligned with ledger entries. Transfers highlighted, dated, undeniable. Each piece dismantled another layer of his narrative. His confidence drained visibly. His hands shook as he picked up the papers, scanning numbers he already knew but had hoped would remain buried. He tried to interrupt, to dismiss them as misunderstandings, but the lawyer spoke calmly, methodically, explaining consequences instead of threats. Court costs. Asset division. Legal definitions that didn't bend to excuses. For the first time in years, he wasn't the loudest voice in the room. When he finally snapped, standing up, accusing her of greed, of revenge, of going too far, she didn't respond. She didn't need to. Everything he was saying now contradicted the image he had tried to sell just minutes earlier. The cafe went quiet. A few heads turned. He stormed out without paying, dignity trailing behind him like a forgotten coat. She sat there a moment longer, breathing evenly, then closed the folder. Outside, the air felt lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because she had faced him without flinching. The power imbalance that had defined their marriage was gone. And once that balance shifts, it never resets. The days that followed were quieter, but not empty. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like neglect, it felt like space. Space to wake up without anticipating someone else's mood. Space to plan a future without calculating how it might upset another person. She started small. A job interview arranged through a friend. Morning walks that had no deadline. Meals cooked simply, for nourishment rather than approval. None of it looked dramatic from the outside, but inside, everything was different. The woman who once measured her worth by how much she endured was learning a new equation. Peace over performance. Stability over sacrifice. And slowly that equation began to work. Legal processes moved forward the way they always do, methodically, unemotionally. Bank records were obtained, transfers confirmed. The truth no longer relied on her memory or her pain. It lived on paper now, undeniable and complete. She didn't follow the fallout of the failed engagement closely. She didn't need to. Some things collapse on their own once they lose funding, credibility, or silence. What mattered more was what she was building. A steady income. A routine that belonged to her. Evenings spent reading or watching old concerts with her cat curled beside her. These weren't signs of retreat. They were signs of ownership. Occasionally, she thought about the woman she had been at the beginning of the marriage, hopeful, generous, willing to give endlessly without asking where it all went. She didn't judge that version of herself. She understood her now. Survival often disguises itself as patience. Love sometimes looks like erasure until you step far enough away to see it clearly. If there was any regret left, it wasn't about leaving, it was about waiting so long to choose herself. But regret, she learned, is useful only if it sharpens resolve. And hers had never been sharper. One evening, as sunlight faded through the window, she stood on the balcony and looked out over the quiet street. Life hadn't become perfect. It had become honest. She knew there would still be challenges, paperwork, awkward conversations, and memories that surfaced when she least expected them. But she also knew this. She would meet them as herself, not as an accessory to someone else's ambition. The story didn't end with applause or revenge. It ended with something better: agency. And sometimes, the strongest ending isn't the loudest one. It's the moment a woman finally says, without hesitation, "This life is mine."